My name is Jesse, and what I'm about to tell you happened 3 years ago when I was 19 years old and working as a babysitter to earn extra money while studying at college. It was a job I genuinely enjoyed. I had always loved kids, and taking care of them gave me a sense of purpose that I hadn't found in my previous part-time jobs at restaurants or retail stores. I lived in a small college town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows each other, and the worst news of the day was usually about someone crashing their car into a mailbox. It was exactly the kind of community where parents felt comfortable leaving their kids with a 19-year-old babysitter they only knew through references from other parents. The Hendersons were one of the families I regularly worked for. Tom was an engineer at a local company, and Sarah was a nurse at the county hospital. They had a 7-year-old son named Michael, a sweet but shy kid who loved books about dinosaurs and could talk for hours about different extinct species. The Hendersons lived in a 2-story house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by cornfields that stretched as far as the eye could see. The house always felt a little isolated, but during the day, that sense of privacy was pleasant. At night, however, the silence could be unsettling. There were no neighbors in sight, no sound of traffic, just the occasional rustle of wind moving through the cornstalks. That October night started like any other. The Hendersons had an anniversary dinner planned at a restaurant an hour away, and they'd asked me to watch Michael from 6 in the evening until around midnight. It was a schedule I'd done dozens of times before, and Michael was one of the easiest kids I knew to babysit. I arrived at 5:45 p.m., as I always did, so Sarah could give me the evening's instructions before they left. Michael had eaten an early dinner, was allowed 1 hour of TV before his 8 o'clock bedtime, and there was a frozen pizza in the fridge for me if I got hungry later. "There's a storm forecast for tonight," Sarah told me as she put on her earrings. "The power might go out. Flashlights are in the kitchen drawer, and there are candles in the hallway closet." Tom came downstairs, adjusting his tie. "The security system is armed," he informed me. "Just the front and back doors and the downstairs windows. If anything triggers it, the security company will call you first before sending someone." This was new. The Hendersons had never mentioned a security system before, and I wondered if they'd recently installed it. "Has something happened?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Sarah and Tom exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. "There have been some break-ins at rural homes in the next county over," Tom explained. "Probably nothing to worry about, but we'd rather be cautious." They left around 6:15, and the house settled into that familiar quiet of babysitting evenings. Michael and I played a paleontology board game he had gotten for his birthday, then watched a documentary about pterodactyls while he ate a bowl of cereal as a snack. At 8 o'clock sharp, I took him upstairs to get ready for bed. Michael was unusually cooperative that night, brushing his teeth without being reminded and putting on his pajamas without complaint. I read him 2 chapters of a book about a kid who time traveled to study dinosaurs, and by 8:30, he was asleep. I went downstairs to the living room and turned on the TV, keeping the volume low so as not to wake Michael. Outside, I could hear the wind picking up, and the first raindrops began hitting the windows. The storm Sarah had mentioned was rolling in. Around 9, I decided to heat up the pizza in the fridge. While waiting for the oven to preheat, I checked my phone. I had a few text messages from college friends, but nothing urgent. Cell service at the Hendersons' house had always been spotty, especially during storms. It was while I was in the kitchen that I heard the first strange noise. It was a metallic sound, like someone had bumped into something in the backyard. At first, I thought it might be the wind moving something, maybe the patio furniture or one of Tom's gardening tools, but it sounded too deliberate, too specific to be the result of random gusts. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. The porch light was on, casting a circle of visibility into the dark, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. The patio chairs were still in place, and there were no visible tools that could have caused the noise. I returned to the kitchen and put the pizza in the oven. The timer was set for 12 minutes, enough time for the noise to repeat if it had been caused by the wind. But the next 10 minutes passed in silence, except for the steady rain. When I took the pizza out of the oven, the power went out. The house plunged into complete darkness instantly. The constant hum of the refrigerator, the air conditioning, and all the other electronics stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of the rain and my own quickening breath. I'd been through power outages before, but never in a house this isolated. In my college dorm or my parents' house in town, there were always street lights or neighboring houses providing some ambient light. Here, the darkness was total and disorienting. I remembered Sarah's instructions about the flashlights in the kitchen drawer. Moving slowly with my hands outstretched to avoid bumping into anything, I managed to find the right drawer on my second try. My fingers located 2 flashlights, and thankfully, both worked when I flicked the switches. The light was an immediate relief, though the shadows it cast seemed to move in unsettling ways whenever I shifted the flashlights. I decided to find the candles Sarah had mentioned for more stable lighting. I was in the hallway, rummaging through the closet, when I heard the second noise. This time, it came from the front door. It wasn't the sound of wind or rain. It was unmistakably someone trying to open the door. I froze, one flashlight in my hand and an unlit candle in the other. The sound came again, a soft but persistent noise, like someone was jiggling the doorknob or testing if the door was locked. My first instinct was denial. It had to be my imagination, or maybe the wind, but the sound continued for a few more seconds before stopping, and there was no mistaking it for something weather-related. Someone was trying to get into the house. My mind raced as I considered my options. Michael was asleep upstairs, and the Hendersons wouldn't be back until after midnight. My cell phone had poor service in normal conditions, and I had no idea if it would work during the storm with the power out. I cautiously approached the living room window that overlooked the front porch, turning off my flashlight to avoid being seen from outside. I pulled back a corner of the curtain and peered out. At first, I saw nothing. The porch light was off due to the power outage, and the rain made it hard to make out shapes in the dark. But then, in a brief moment, when lightning lit up the area, I saw a figure standing by the front door. It was definitely a person, not an animal or something my imagination conjured. They were dressed in dark clothing and seemed to be examining the door, perhaps looking for a way in. My heart started pounding so loudly I could hear it over the rain. I stepped back from the window and considered my options. I could try calling the police, but I wasn't sure if my phone would work. I could try contacting the Hendersons, but they were an hour away and couldn't get here in time if the situation was immediately dangerous. Then I remembered what Tom had said about the security system. I made my way to the control panel I'd noticed on the wall near the back door. Even without power, the panel had a lit display showing the status of various sensors. All the lights were green, indicating all entry points were secure. But as I watched, the light for the front door turned red. Someone had opened the door. Panic took hold. Whoever it was had managed to get the front door open, and they were now inside the house. The security system was supposed to contact the monitoring company, but with no power, I had no way of knowing if the signal had gone through. I crept upstairs as quietly as I could, heading for Michael's bedroom. My plan was to wake him, take him to his parents' master bedroom, and locked the door while I figured out what to do next. Michael was fast asleep when I reached his room. I shook him gently, whispering his name, trying to wake him without making noise. He mumbled something incoherent, but didn't fully wake up. "Michael," I whispered more urgently, "I need you to wake up. We have to go to your parents' room." He finally opened his eyes, confused and groggy. "Jesse, what's wrong?" "There's someone in the house," I told him as calmly as I could. "We need to hide until help comes." Even at 7 years old, Michael understood the seriousness of the situation. He got up immediately and followed me to his parents' bedroom at the end of the hallway. The master bedroom had a lock on the door, something I'd noticed on previous visits, but never had to use. I locked it as soon as we were inside, and Michael and I sat in the farthest corner from the door. I tried calling 911 on my cell phone, but I had no signal. I tried calling the Hendersons, but that didn't work either. The storm and power outage had completely cut off my ability to communicate with the outside world. For the next few minutes, we listened to sounds coming from downstairs. Footsteps, but deliberately quiet, as if the person was trying not to make noise. The sound of drawers being opened. Occasionally, the creak of floorboards under weight. Michael curled up against me, and I could feel him trembling. I whispered that everything would be okay, that the police would come soon, but I wasn't sure I believed my own words. The sounds continued for what felt like an eternity. Whoever was downstairs seemed to be systematically searching the house, likely looking for valuables. On several occasions, we heard footsteps on the stairs, and my heart stopped each time, expecting the person to try the bedroom door. But the footsteps always retreated after a few seconds. It was as if the person knew we were hiding upstairs, but had decided to leave us alone while they finished what they came to do. After what must have been 2 hours, though it felt like the entire night, the sound stopped. We waited in silence for another 30 minutes before I dared to whisper that I thought the person was gone. "Can we go downstairs?" Michael asked. "Not yet," I said. "Let's wait a little longer to be sure." In hindsight, that was the right decision. About 15 minutes later, we heard a car pulling into the driveway. Michael and I froze, wondering if the person had returned with others, but then we heard familiar voices. It was the Hendersons, coming back early from their dinner. We heard the front door open, and then Tom's voice. "Jesse, where are the lights?" "We're upstairs," I shouted, my voice cracking with tension and relief. "Someone broke into the house." The next few minutes were a whirlwind of activity. Tom had a flashlight in his car and quickly lit up the house, while Sarah ran upstairs to check on Michael and me. They called the police from Tom's cell phone, which had better reception than mine. The police arrived within 30 minutes, along with utility company technicians who had been called to restore power. Once the lights were back on, the reality of what had happened became clear. The house had been meticulously ransacked. Drawers opened, closets searched, mattresses shifted. The intruder had been thorough, but relatively careful, not breaking anything or causing significant damage. Several items were taken: the flat-screen TV from the living room, some of Sarah's jewelry, Tom's laptop, and cash the Hendersons kept in a small safe in their bedroom. The total value of the theft was estimated at about $5,000. But what disturbed me most was what the police officers told me when I described the sounds I'd heard during the 2 hours the person was in the house. "Based on your description," one of the detectives told me, "it sounds like the person knew you were hiding upstairs. The footsteps on the stairs were probably checks to make sure you hadn't come down." "Why didn't they try to get into the bedroom?" I asked. "They probably didn't want a confrontation," he explained. "Most burglars avoid contact with occupants when possible. It's easier and less risky to just take what they want and leave." That answer should have reassured me, but instead, it made me feel even more uneasy. The idea that someone had been consciously allowing us to hide while they robbed the house was somehow more unsettling than the alternative. The Hendersons were incredibly understanding and grateful. Sarah hugged me and told me I'd done exactly the right thing by keeping Michael safe. Tom mentioned several times that he was proud of how I'd handled the situation, but I didn't feel like a hero. I felt traumatized and scared, and the thought of being alone in an isolated house filled me with dread. The police investigation eventually determined that the burglar was part of a string of home invasions that had been occurring during bad weather and power outages. The criminals had been monitoring weather reports and targeting rural homes likely to lose electricity during storms. They never caught the person who broke into the Hendersons' house that night. The case stayed open for months, but with no solid leads or useful physical evidence, it eventually went cold. The Hendersons installed a more sophisticated security system and surveillance cameras after the break-in. They also asked me to come back to babysit Michael, offering me a significant raise in my hourly rate. I tried going back to work for them a few weeks later, but I found I couldn't handle being in that house after dark. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow looked suspicious. Michael noticed my nervousness and started asking questions about why I seemed scared all the time. Eventually, I had to tell the Hendersons I couldn't continue babysitting Michael at night. It was one of the hardest decisions I'd made because I genuinely loved that family, but my mental health couldn't handle the stress. I continued working as a babysitter for other families, but only during the day and only in houses within town where there were neighbors nearby. I never took jobs at isolated homes again, and I always made sure there was good cell reception before accepting any job. The experience fundamentally changed my perspective on personal safety. Before that night, I'd had that typical 19-year-old sense of invincibility, the feeling that bad things happened to other people. Afterward, I became hypervigilant about locks, security systems, escape plans, and always keeping my phone fully charged. I also developed a new appreciation for emergency workers and the importance of having multiple forms of communication during crises. If I'd had access to a landline that night, or if the security system had a battery backup, the situation would have been far less terrifying. But more than anything, I learned about my own ability to stay calm under pressure. Though I'd been terrified throughout the experience, I'd managed to keep Michael safe and make rational decisions that kept us secure. That realization gave me a confidence I didn't know I had. Michael and I stayed in touch after I stopped babysitting him. He's 10 years old now, and he occasionally sends me drawings of dinosaurs via email. His parents have told me he rarely mentions that night, and he doesn't seem to have developed lasting fears as a result of the experience. I'm grateful we came out of that night physically unharmed. The burglar could have been violent, could have decided they didn't want witnesses, could have done many things differently that would have resulted in a much worse outcome. But the psychological trauma lingered longer than I expected. For months afterward, I had nightmares about dark figures on porches, about being trapped in houses without power, about unexplained sounds in the dark. I sought therapy through my university's mental health center, and that helped immensely. I learned techniques for managing anxiety and strategies for processing traumatic experiences. I also learned that my reaction was completely normal and that there was nothing wrong with being affected by what had happened. 3 years later, I can finally tell this story without feeling that familiar tightness in my chest. I can be alone in houses at night without panicking, though I'll admit I'm still more cautious than I was before. The experience taught me that life can change in an instant, that the sense of safety we take for granted can be shattered by the actions of a stranger on a stormy night. But it also taught me about resilience, about the human capacity to protect others even when we're terrified, and about the importance of trusting our instincts. Michael and I survived that night, and though the recovery process was long and difficult, I'm grateful for the lessons I learned about myself and about the importance of community and support in our darkest moments. The next time I hear someone dismiss another person's fears or suggest that someone is overreacting about their need for safety, I'll remember that October night when a stranger broke into a house where I was babysitting a child, and how 2 hours of terror can change a person's perspective forever. But I'll also remember that we survived, that we found strength when we didn't know we had it, and that even in our most vulnerable moments, there is hope. My name is Mia, and until 2 years ago, I thought I knew my story. I lived in Auckland, New Zealand, with the people I believed to be my biological parents, David and Margaret Thompson. I was 23 years old, working as a graphic designer for a small agency downtown, and I considered my life fairly normal, though somewhat distant from my parents. The Thompsons had always been cold, not in an abusive or overtly neglectful way, but there was an emotional distance I could never fully explain. Growing up, I attributed this coldness to their naturally reserved personalities. David was an accountant at a prestigious firm, and Margaret worked as an administrator at a private school. Both valued structure, discipline, and the appearance of respectability above all else. But there was one person in my life who had been consistently warm and loving: Elena Varga, my nanny. Elena had been with me for as long as I could remember. Officially, she started working for the Thompsons when I was 2 years old and stayed with our family for the next 2 decades. She was a Hungarian woman, about 45 years old when she began working for us, with dark brown hair, always tied back in a loose braid, and green eyes that seemed to hold a deep sadness I could never quite understand. What always struck me as odd was the almost obsessive devotion Elena showed toward me. It wasn't the professional affection you'd expect from a long-term nanny. It was something deeper, more visceral. She cared for me as if her life depended on it, anticipating my needs before I even recognized them myself. Elena knew exactly how to comfort me when I had nightmares. She knew my favorite foods and prepared them without me asking. When I was sick, she stayed up all night by my side, monitoring my temperature and ensuring I was comfortable. During my teenage years, when my relationship with David and Margaret grew even more strained, Elena was my confidant and emotional refuge. The Thompsons tolerated Elena's presence, but there was always an underlying tension I couldn't understand. David spoke to her with a cold politeness that bordered on hostility, and Margaret seemed to constantly find excuses to criticize Elena's work or limit the time she spent with me. Elena is not family, Margaret told me when I was about 10 years old and suggested Elena join us for a Christmas dinner. She's hired help. You need to understand the difference. But to me, Elena was more family than my own parents. She was the one who attended my school plays when David and Margaret were too busy. She was the one who comforted me when kids at school teased me. She was the one who celebrated my achievements with genuine joy and pride. When I turned 18 and moved out to attend university, Elena continued working for the Thompsons, maintaining the house and seemingly waiting for my visits during holidays. Even after I graduated and got my own apartment in Auckland, Elena and I stayed in regular contact. She visited my apartment on weekends, bringing homemade food and asking about my work and social life. It was during one of those visits, 2 years ago, that everything changed. Elena arrived on a Saturday afternoon with her usual container of Hungarian goulash and fresh bread. We were sitting in my small kitchen, chatting about my latest design project, when I noticed she seemed more restless than usual. There was a tension in her shoulders and an expression in her eyes that suggested she was grappling with some major decision. "Mia," she said finally, setting her teacup down on the table with trembling hands. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Her tone alarmed me immediately. Elena had never sounded so serious, so laden with emotion. "What's wrong, Elena? Are you okay?" She took a deep breath, and when she looked at me, I saw tears forming in her eyes. "I'm not just your nanny, Mia. I'm your mother." The words hit like a punch to the stomach. For a moment, I couldn't process what she'd said. It was so unexpected, so impossible, that my mind simply refused to accept it. "What?" was all I managed to say. "I'm your biological mother," Elena repeated, tears now streaming freely down her cheeks. "David and Margaret adopted you when you were 6 months old, but I could never walk away from you." My world unraveled in that moment. Every certainty I'd had about my identity, my family, my history, became questionable in an instant. "That's impossible," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant, even to me. "My parents would have told me. You would have told me." Elena shook her head, sobbing openly now. "I wanted to tell you. I've wanted to tell you every single day for the last 23 years. But David and Margaret, they threatened me. They said if I ever told you the truth, I'd never see you again." The room seemed to spin around me. I stood up from the table so abruptly that my chair tipped over, and I began pacing the small kitchen, trying to process this impossible information. But how? Why? "I don't understand any of this." Elena wiped her eyes with a handkerchief she'd pulled from her purse. "I was very young when I got pregnant with you. I was 18, newly arrived in New Zealand from Hungary. Your father, he was a university student I met in Auckland. When I told him I was pregnant, he disappeared. His family had money and connections, and they basically erased any trace of his relationship with me." She kept talking, but I could barely focus on her words. The reality I'd known my entire life was crumbling piece by piece. I had no money, no family here, no support. I was living in a tiny apartment in a rough part of the city, working cleaning jobs to survive. When you were born, I tried to take care of you on my own, but it was so hard. I couldn't afford daycare. I couldn't afford to miss work, and I was constantly worried about our safety. Elena paused, taking another deep breath before continuing. "David and Margaret had been trying to have children for years without success. Margaret knew someone in social services who was aware of my situation. They contacted me through this person, offering to adopt my baby." "And you just agreed?" I asked, my voice sounding harsher than I intended. "It wasn't that simple," Elena replied, her voice breaking. "I refused outright at first. But then you had a severe respiratory infection when you were 5 months old. You spent a week in the hospital, and I couldn't pay all the medical bills. The Thompsons offered to cover all the expenses and provide a secure future for you." She stopped, struggling to compose her words. But the part I didn't understand until years later was that they also negotiated for me to stay in your life as your nanny. I thought it was out of kindness, that they understood how hard it would be for me to part with you completely. "But it wasn't kindness," I said, beginning to grasp the darker implications of the story. Elena shook her head. "No, it was control. They realized that keeping me there, but in a subservient position, gave them power over both of us. They could keep me close to monitor me, ensuring I never told the truth. And they could use me as a constant threat. If you ever questioned their authority too much or became too difficult to handle, they could fire me and remove the one person in your life who truly loved you unconditionally. The calculated cruelty of it left me speechless. Throughout my childhood, I'd sensed the tension between Eleanor and my adoptive parents, but I'd never understood it was the result of a sadistic form of emotional blackmail. How could they do that to you? I asked. How could they be so cruel? David and Margaret are people who value control above all else, Eleanor explained. To them, I wasn't a person with feelings and rights. I was a problem to be managed. Keeping me as hired help allowed them to have a biological mother in the house without ever acknowledging my relationship with you or giving me any real authority over your upbringing. For the next few minutes, Eleanor told me more details about the early years after the adoption, how David and Margaret had set strict rules about how much time she could spend with me and what kinds of interactions were allowed, how they forbade any physical affection beyond what would be considered appropriate between a nanny and her charge, how they monitored our conversations and censored anything that might suggest a deeper connection between us. But as you grew older, Eleanor continued, it became harder for them to fully control our relationship. You were smart and perceptive, and you started noticing there was something different about how I related to you compared to how other nannies related to their employers. I remembered moments from my childhood when I'd questioned why Elena seemed to know so much about my likes and dislikes, why she seemed so attuned to my emotional states, why she seemed to take my well-being so personally. During your teenage years, Eleanor went on, David and Margaret became more aggressive in their attempts to limit our time together. They started inventing reasons to send me on errands during your after-school hours. They banned me from attending school events. They even considered firing me completely when you were 15. Why didn't they? I asked. Because they knew you'd ask questions. By then, it was obvious you considered me an essential part of your life. Firing me abruptly would have required explanations they weren't prepared to give. Elena explained how she'd lived in constant terror for years, knowing David and Margaret had the power to remove her from my life at any moment. She'd accepted below-market wages, unreasonable working conditions, and regular humiliations because the alternative was losing all contact with me. But why are you telling me now? I asked. What's changed? Eleanor took a deep breath. Margaret is sick. She has late-stage cancer, though they haven't told you yet. I know because I've been handling her medical appointments and have seen her test results. This was another shock. Margaret had never mentioned health issues, though in hindsight, she had seemed frailer lately. David is starting to make plans for after Margaret dies, Eleanor continued. He's been talking about selling the house, moving to Australia to be closer to his brother, and he's made it clear that when that happens, my services will no longer be needed. The implication was clear. Elena was losing her last chance to tell me the truth. Also, Eleanor added, her voice trembling, I can't live with this lie anymore. You've been the most important thing in my life for 23 years, and I've never been able to tell you that I love you as a mother loves her daughter. I've never been able to explain why your happiness and well-being matter more to me than my own life. We sat in silence for several minutes after that. My mind was processing not only the information Elena had given me, but also reevaluating every interaction I'd ever had with David and Margaret. Their emotional coldness suddenly made sense. Their apparent lack of parental instinct, the way they often seemed to be performing a role rather than relating to me authentically, the way they'd always discouraged my questions about my early childhood or why I didn't have siblings. "I need proof," I said finally. "I need something more than your word." Elena nodded, as if she'd been expecting this reaction. "Of course. I have your original birth certificate, where I'm listed as your mother. I also have photographs from when you were a baby, before the adoption, and I have documents from the adoption agency. How did you get those things?" "I kept copies of everything before signing the adoption papers. David and Margaret didn't know I had these things. I've kept them in a safe deposit box all these years, waiting for the day I could share them with you." Elena left that afternoon, promising to bring the documents the following week. The next few days were the hardest of my life. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every certainty I'd had about my identity was in question. I also began seeing my past interactions with David and Margaret in a completely new light. I remembered moments when they'd seemed almost resentful of the attention Elena gave me, moments when they deliberately interrupted conversations between Elena and me. The way they'd always spoken of Elena as if she were replaceable, despite her being with our family for decades. When Elena returned the next week, she brought a box of documents that confirmed her story. The original birth certificate was particularly jarring. It clearly listed Elena Varga as the mother and father unknown on the corresponding line. The date and hospital matched what I'd always believed about my birth. The photographs were equally compelling. They showed Elena, clearly younger, but unmistakably her, holding a baby who was obviously me. In the photos, Elena looked exhausted but radiant, with the kind of expression you only see on a new mother's face. The adoption documents revealed additional details about the circumstances of the agreement. It was clear Elena had been pressured into signing, with legal language heavily favoring the Thompsons and providing minimal protections for Elena's rights as a biological mother. But there was another document in the box that disturbed me more than the others, a series of letters Elena had written to me over the years but never delivered. The letters began when I was 2 years old and continued until my most recent birthday. In them, Elena documented major milestones, expressed her love for me, and explained decisions she'd made on my behalf. She also described the constant struggle of being in my life, but unable to claim her role as my mother. One letter, written when I was 10 years old, was particularly heartbreaking. "My dearest Mia, today I saw you in your school play, performing as a tree in your class's environmental production. You were so proud of your costume, which you'd helped make at home with Margaret. It broke my heart that you couldn't run to me after the play to show me your costume, like you do with David and Margaret. Instead, I had to wait until the next day, when Margaret was at work, to ask you about it. I pretended I hadn't been there, that I'd only heard about the play from other parents. It's lie after lie, and I hate every one of them. But if lying is the price I have to pay to stay in your life, I'll pay that price every day until I die." Reading these letters was devastating. Throughout my childhood, Elena had been documenting her love for me in secret, creating a record of motherhood she'd never been able to express openly. After reviewing all the documents, there was no doubt Elena was telling the truth. But that led to the inevitable question, what to do with this information? My first reaction was anger toward David and Margaret. Not only had they lied to me my entire life, but they'd orchestrated a particularly cruel form of psychological torture for Elena. They'd kept her close enough to watch her daughter grow, but subordinate enough that she could never claim her role as a mother. I also felt betrayed by Elena. Why had she waited so long to tell me? Why had she allowed this charade to continue for over 2 decades? But when I expressed these feelings, Eleanor explained the impossible position she'd been in. Every day, for 23 years, I've had to choose between telling you the truth and risking losing you forever, or keeping the lie and at least staying in your life, she told me. How could I have made that choice? If I'd told you when you were younger, David and Margaret would have followed through on their threat. They would have taken you away from me, and maybe even moved to ensure I could never find you. I came to understand that Elena had been trapped in a situation where any action she took would have devastating consequences. Keeping the secret was painful, but revealing it would have been catastrophic. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor and I spent long hours talking about the past. She told me stories about my early childhood that David and Margaret had never shared. She explained small habits and quirks of mine she'd noticed since I was a baby. She showed me more photographs and mementos she'd kept in secret over the years. Gradually, I began to realize that Elena knew aspects of my personality and history that even David and Margaret didn't know. She'd been watching me more closely, with more emotional investment than the people who were officially my parents. But the question remained, should I confront David and Margaret about their deception? Eleanor begged me not to, at least not immediately. Margaret is dying, she reminded me, and while what they did was terrible, creating drama and conflict in her final months won't do any good. Besides, now that you know the truth, they no longer have power over me. We can build a real relationship now, regardless of what they think or do. I decided to follow Elena's advice, at least temporarily. Instead of confronting David and Margaret right away, Elena and I began spending more time together, this time with the honest understanding of our real relationship. It was during this period that I truly began to understand how much Elena had sacrificed for me. Not only had she given up her rights as a mother, but she'd accepted a life of servitude and humiliation to stay near me. She'd put my needs above her own dignity and well-being for over 2 decades. I also began to see how her maternal love had shaped my development in ways I'd never acknowledged. My self-confidence, my capacity for empathy, my sense of emotional security. These had come primarily from Eleanor, not from David and Margaret. Margaret died 4 months after Eleanor told me the truth. During her final weeks, while she was in palliative care, she occasionally mentioned concerns about what would happen to me after she was gone. "I hope you stay in touch with Elena," she told me during one of my last visits. "She's been very important in your life." There was irony in that statement, coming from someone who had spent decades deliberately limiting the relationship between Eleanor and me. I wondered if Margaret had any level of remorse about how they treated Eleanor, or if she was simply getting sentimental in her final days. After Margaret's funeral, David announced that he indeed planned to move to Australia. He also informed me that Elena's services would no longer be needed, as he would be selling the family home. "Of course, you can keep in touch with her if you want," he told me, as if granting permission for a casual friendship. "She's been a good employee all these years." I didn't tell David I already knew the truth about Elena. Instead, I simply nodded and said, I indeed plan to stay in touch with her. David moved to Australia 6 months later. He sold the family home and took most of the family's possessions, including photo albums from my childhood that legally and morally should have included Eleanor. But by then, Eleanor and I had already begun building a new life together. She moved into a small apartment near mine, and we started spending time together without the constraints and restrictions David and Margaret had imposed for so many years. For the first time in her life, Elena could openly call me her daughter. She could tell her friends and co-workers about me without having to explain the complicated situation of being just the nanny. She could participate in my life as a mother, not as hired help. For me, it was a process of re-knowing someone who had been in my life for over 2 decades. I began to notice mannerisms and expressions in Elena that were similar to mine. I discovered we shared interests and perspectives I'd never noticed before. I learned about Hungarian culture and my family history that Elena had never been able to share when she was confined to her role as a nanny. I also began therapy to process the trauma of discovering that my entire understanding of my family identity had been a lie. The therapist helped me understand that David and Margaret, while they had provided material stability and educational opportunities, had never been true parents to me in the emotional sense. Parental love isn't about biology, the therapist explained. It's about emotional commitment, consistent care, and prioritizing the child's well-being. Based on what you've told me, Elena has been your real mother your entire life, regardless of the legal documents. 2 years after learning the truth, Elena and I have developed the mother-daughter relationship that should always have existed. We have dinner together several times a week. She helps me with major life and career decisions. I take care of her when she's sick and include her in all the important aspects of my life. We've started new traditions that belong only to us. We cook traditional Hungarian dishes together. We visit places that are meaningful to Elena from her early years in New Zealand. We've begun planning a trip to Hungary so I can meet Elena's family, my family that I never knew I had. Elena has also begun to flourish in ways I'd never seen before. For all the years I knew her as my nanny, there was an underlying sadness in her I could never understand. Now I realize it was the pain of loving her daughter but being unable to claim that relationship. With that burden finally lifted, Elena has become more vibrant, more confident, more herself. She started taking art classes, something she always wanted to do but never had the time or energy for while working as a domestic employee. She's made new friends and begun building a social life that doesn't revolve entirely around caring for others. For me, having an honest relationship with Elena has filled an emotional void I never knew I had. The coldness I'd always felt from David and Margaret now made sense. They had never been my true parents, only guardians who provided basic needs while systematically alienating me from my real mother. I occasionally receive letters from David in Australia. They're polite but distant, asking about my work and life in general terms. He never mentions Elena, and I never mention that I now know the truth about our relationship. Part of me feels I should confront him about the deception and the cruelty of how they treated Elena, but another part of me recognizes that David is an older man who has lost his wife and is living alone in a foreign country. Creating drama now won't change the past, and Elena and I have found our happiness regardless of what he thinks or does. Elena and I often talk about how our lives might have been different if she had had the courage or resources to tell me the truth years earlier, but we also acknowledge that the circumstances that brought us to this point, while painful, ultimately allowed us to maintain a connection through all those years when we could have been completely separated. I can't regret the decisions I made, Elena told me recently, because those decisions allowed me to watch you grow, to be there for the important moments in your life, and to keep you safe. If I'd chosen differently, I might have lost all of that. The process of rebuilding our relationship hasn't been without challenges. Both Elena and I have had to learn new ways of relating to each other. Elena had to learn to express opinions and make demands as a mother after years of maintaining a subordinate position. I had to learn to see Elena as a maternal authority figure rather than just a loving caregiver. We've also had to navigate the process of creating new memories and traditions while honoring the ones we already had. Birthdays, holidays, and milestones now have new meaning because we can finally celebrate them as mother and daughter. But perhaps most importantly, both Elena and I have found a sense of wholeness that was missing for all those years. Elena can finally express her maternal love openly, and I finally have access to the kind of unconditional love only a mother can provide. Looking back at the deception and manipulation of David and Margaret, I feel a mix of anger and sadness. Anger for the years Elena and I lost to authentic connection, and sadness because David and Margaret never experienced the kind of genuine love that comes from an authentic parental relationship. But mostly, I feel gratitude that Elena had the strength to endure years of psychological manipulation. Gratitude that she finally had the courage to tell me the truth. And gratitude that despite all the obstacles, the love between a mother and daughter managed to endure and ultimately triumph. Today, when Elena and I sit in her kitchen, sharing stories and planning the future, I can see the peace in her eyes that was missing for all those years, and I can feel a sense of belonging and unconditional love I'd never experienced before. We found our way back to each other, and now nothing can separate us again. The secrets that once defined our relationship have been replaced by honesty, openness, and the kind of bond that should have existed from the beginning. In many ways, this has been the most terrifying and transformative experience of my life. Learning that everything I thought I knew about my family identity was based on deception was traumatic, but ultimately, it was also liberating, because now I know who truly loves me, who has sacrificed for my well-being, and where I truly belong. And that knowledge has made all the pain and confusion worthwhile. Elena is my mother in every way that matters. And finally, after 23 years, we can be exactly that, mother and daughter together. Hello everyone, I'm Erica, and this is a memory that has branded itself into me like a hot iron on skin, one that wakes me at night with my heart pounding as if it's about to burst. I live in a quiet suburb of Sydney, Australia, in a modest house with a backyard where kookaburras laugh at dawn and the scent of eucalyptus drifts through open windows on summer mornings. I'm 32 years old now, working as a coordinator at a children's daycare, surrounded by the laughter of kids that reminds me why I keep doing this, despite everything. But 5 years ago, when I was 27, my life was different. I was a single girl, freshly graduated with a degree in early childhood education, struggling to pay bills in a shared flat in central Melbourne, where the clatter of trams and the bustle of the streets kept me awake until dawn. It was a time when I needed extra cash, and a nighttime babysitting gig seemed like the perfect lifeline. What I didn't know was that this decision would lead me into a personal hell, one made of family secrets, hidden abuse, and a guilt that still stalks me like a shadow on stormy nights, when the wind howls and branches tap the windows like accusing fingers. Sit down, because this isn't just an anecdote. It's a haunting memory that makes me question whether I'll ever sleep peacefully again. It all began on a grey autumn afternoon when Melbourne's sky looked like a dirty sheet draped over the city, and the air smelled of impending rain mixed with smoke from the chimneys of old neighbourhoods. I was in my shared flat, a cramped place with thin walls where you could hear neighbours arguing about football or cooking curry that infused everything with its spiced aroma. I'd finished my degree in early childhood education a few months earlier, but the job market was saturated. Daycare positions were scarce, and in the meantime, I got by with temp jobs as a waitress at a downtown cafe, serving oat milk lattes to hipsters who requested foam art like it was modern masterpiece. My flatmates, a pair of art students who always left dirty paintbrushes in the sink and half-finished canvases leaning against the walls, had passed along an ad they saw on a local Facebook group. Responsible babysitter wanted for 7-year-old boy. Night shifts, 3 times a week. Good pay. Contact privately. The salary was tempting, $200 a night, plus tips if the child behaved well. And since I had no classes or a steady job, I replied to the ad that same afternoon, typing on my phone with anxious fingers, while the smell of burnt coffee from the kitchen reminded me I needed money to cover my share of the rent before my flatmates started giving me side-eye. The response came quickly. A message from the mother, a woman named Sarah, who sounded desperate but professional. "Hi, Erica. Thanks for responding. My husband and I work night shifts. He's a doctor at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, and I'm a nurse there too. Our son, Oliver, needs someone reliable to watch him from 8 at night until midnight, 3 days a week. He's a quiet kid, but he's been having trouble sleeping lately. Can you come for an interview tomorrow?" I agreed, and the next day I found myself at their home, a modern duplex in a residential suburb where the streets were lined with neatly trimmed gardens and the air smelled of freshly cut grass, a stark contrast to the urban chaos of my flat. Sarah was a woman in her mid-30s with deep under-eye circles that betrayed sleepless nights, blonde hair pulled into a messy bun, and a nurse's uniform she still wore, as if she'd just come from work. Her husband, Mark, was tall, with a trimmed beard and a serious expression that made me feel evaluated from the moment I stepped inside. Oliver, the boy, was a 7-year-old with large dark eyes, tousled brown hair, and a shy smile that didn't reach his eyes. He clung to his mother's leg during the interview, gripping her as if afraid she'd leave. "He's a bit shy at first, but he warms up quickly," Sarah said with a forced smile, while Mark nodded silently, his gaze fixed on me as if searching for a flaw. They asked about my experience. I'd watched my nephews and volunteered at a daycare during uni, and they seemed satisfied. "You'll start Monday," Mark said, extending his hand with a firm grip that left my palm sore. They paid in cash at the end of each shift, and the job seemed perfect. Reading stories, preparing simple dinners like mac and cheese that Oliver devoured with childlike gusto, and ensuring he was asleep before his parents returned around midnight when the neighborhood was quiet, save for the occasional bark of a distant dog. The first few days were routine, almost boring, but with a simple charm that made me feel useful in a world where my degree hadn't yet led to anything stable. Oliver was a quiet child, with a room full of toys he barely touched, Legos stacked in a dusty corner, a worn teddy bear he hugged as if it were his only friend, and drawings on the walls showing happy families with exaggerated smiles, but always with an odd detail, like elongated shadows looming over the figures. He told me stories about his school, how his classmates called him Ollie the Silent, because he didn't talk much in class, and I tried to cheer him up with games like building block towers that collapsed with laughter, the sound of Legos falling like rain on the creaking wooden floor. But soon I noticed something that unsettled me, a detail I initially dismissed as a childish accident: bruises. The first one I saw was on his left arm, a purple mark the size of a coin peeking out from under the sleeve of his superhero pajamas as I helped him change for bed. "Ollie, "What happened here?" I asked casually, trying not to sound alarmed, while the minty smell of toothpaste lingered in the small bathroom with white tiles reflecting the yellowish ceiling light. He shrugged, looking at the floor with evasive eyes, and mumbled, "I fell at recess." His voice was low, almost a whisper, and he didn't meet my gaze, leaving me with a knot in my stomach like I'd eaten something bad, a premonition that settled heavy and cold in my chest. I didn't think much of it that time. Kids fall, they get hurt, it's normal. But the next day, when I lifted his shirt to bathe him, I saw more. A fresh bruise on his back, the size of an open palm, with jagged edges suggesting not a fall, but a deliberate blow, and another on his leg, yellowish green, as if it had been there for days. "Ollie, this doesn't look like a fall." "Did someone hurt you?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly as the hot bath water filled the tub with steam that fogged the mirror, reflecting my worried face like a distorted ghost. He shook his head, eyes down, and said, "No, it was an accident." But his voice was a thin thread, brittle as glass, that could shatter with one more word, and it didn't convince me. There was fear in his eyes, a deep fear that didn't belong to a 7-year-old playing with Legos in a safe room. At first, I tried not to obsess, telling myself he might be clumsy or played rough at school, where kids ran wildly chasing each other with sticks and balls that flew like projectiles. But the bruises kept appearing, one on his shoulder, round like a fingerprint, another on his rib that made him wince when I accidentally touched it while helping him into pajamas. And each time I asked, Oliver clammed up like an oyster, his answers monosyllabic and evasive. I fell. I bumped into the door. "It's nothing," with his gaze fixed on the floor as if the pattern of his bedroom carpet, a blue rug with glow-in-the-dark stars, held all the secrets of the universe he didn't want to reveal. The parents' apartment was immaculate, with modern furniture that smelled of lemon cleaner and family photos in silver frames where everyone smiled perfectly. But beneath that facade, something reeked, a metaphorical stench of rot that seeped into my thoughts every time I left Oliver alone with his parents at the end of my shift, hearing their footsteps on the stairs as I descended, their echo resounding like a reminder of my powerlessness. Sarah and Mark seemed like model parents, always punctual, polite, with smiles that didn't reach their eyes when they paid me in cash at the end of the night. "Thanks, Erica. Oliver adores you," they said, but their tone was flat, like reciting a memorized script. I started noticing how Oliver tensed when he heard the key in the door signaling their arrival, his small body shrinking into the couch as if he wanted to disappear into the cushions, his childish laughter cut off abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence that filled the room like thick smoke. One night, after a dinner of chicken nuggets that Oliver ate with ravenous hunger, as if afraid it would run out, I asked him directly, "Ollie, is someone hurting you? You can tell me. I'm your friend." He looked at me with wide eyes, filled with a terror that shouldn't exist in a child, and whispered, "No, but don't tell anyone, please." His voice was a fragile thread, and I didn't press further, afraid of breaking it. But that response was like an alarm blaring in my head, a constant beep that kept me awake when I returned to my flat, the night train rattling under the rain that pounded the windows like incessant tears. I decided to observe more closely, turning into an amateur detective in my spare time, taking notes in a notebook hidden in my bag, where I recorded every new bruise, every change in his behavior, every excuse he gave with a trembling voice. The bruises varied, some fresh and red like ripe apples, others yellowish like overripe bananas, and one in particular shaped like a hand on his thin arm, made me clench my teeth until they hurt, imagining adult fingers gripping that delicate skin like moldable clay. Oliver began avoiding physical contact, rejecting hugs he used to accept with a shy smile, and his drawings, once made with vibrant crayons at the kitchen table while I cooked dinner, turned darker. Solitary figures in empty rooms, with elongated shadows looming like invisible threats, the smell of melted wax mixing with the aroma of food cooking on the stove. One night, while reading him a fairy tale, one of those glossy books where princesses always get saved, he curled up against me, his head on my shoulder, and murmured, "Parents get mad sometimes, but it's my fault." His voice was a broken whisper, and I felt a chill that didn't come from the autumn wind seeping through the house's poorly sealed windows, but from a deep terror settling in my chest like a lead weight. "Ollie, no one deserves to be hurt, not even if they make mistakes," I said, trying to sound calm while my mind raced like a runaway train, imagining horrific scenarios I didn't want to accept as real. He didn't respond, just clung tighter, his small body trembling slightly against mine. And in that moment, the suspense turned into certainty. Something terrible was happening in that house when I wasn't there. A dark secret hiding behind Sarah and Mark's perfect smiles. A real monster lurking in the suburban normalcy of Melbourne. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The fear for Oliver consumed me. A slow burning fire that flared every time I left him alone with his parents, imagining what might happen in the hours I wasn't there. The echo of his imagined screams ringing in my head like a distant but persistent echo. I started documenting everything, discreet photos of the bruises taken when changing his clothes or during bath time, with my phone hidden in my apron pocket, the flash off to avoid alerting him, though each click felt like a betrayal of his trust, an added weight on my conscience that made me question if I was doing the right thing or invading his privacy in a way that could hurt him more. I noticed patterns. The bruises appeared after weekends when Sarah and Mark were alone with him, or after nights when they came home late from work, with tired expressions hiding something more sinister, like pent-up anger unleashed in the privacy of the home. Oliver began avoiding mentioning his parents, changing the subject with a quickness unnatural for a child, his eyes darting to the floor as if staring into an abyss only he could see. One afternoon, while playing with Legos, building an unstable tower that collapsed with forced laughter, he paused, his little hand stopping mid-placement of a red block, and answered my casual question, "Ollie, what do you do when Mom and Dad get mad?" With a small voice, barely audible over the hum of the living room fan, "I hide in my closet until it's over." His response was like a punch to the gut, a sharp pain that left me breathless, imagining that small child curled up in the darkness of a closet, smelling of mothballs and old clothes, waiting for the storm to pass, his ears covered to block out the shouts or blows he didn't want to hear. I couldn't hold back tears that time, disguising them as a dust allergy from the shelves in his room, but the suspense grew, a knot in my throat that made it hard to swallow, knowing I had to act but fearing the consequences, the smell of dinner burning in the kitchen because my mind was elsewhere, on a future where Oliver might be saved or where I could lose everything for interfering in something that wasn't my family. I decided to confront Sarah and Mark, but carefully, as if walking through a minefield where one wrong step could detonate everything. One night, after Oliver fell asleep, his breathing soft and rhythmic, like a clock ticking down the time before something exploded, I waited for them to arrive. Sarah came in first, her nurse's uniform wrinkled and dark circles speaking of endless shifts, the smell of hospital antiseptic clinging to her skin like a bitter perfume. Mark followed, briefcase in hand, and a tired expression that didn't hide his usual impatience. "Erica, everything okay with Oliver?" Sarah asked, with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes, as she set her bag on the kitchen counter with a dull thud that echoed in the house's silence. "Yes, he fell asleep an hour ago, but I need to talk to you both," I replied, my voice trembling slightly, feeling the weight of the photos on my phone like burning evidence that could scorch me if mishandled. I showed them the pictures of the bruises, zoomed in on the screen so they couldn't deny them, the blue and purple contrasting with Oliver's pale skin like a map of pain that couldn't be ignored. Sarah paled, her face draining of color as if blood had fled her veins, and Mark tensed, his fists clenching until his knuckles whitened, the kitchen air thickening with a suspense as dense as fog, making it hard to breathe. "These are accidents, Erica. Oliver's an active kid. He falls playing," Sarah said, her voice trying to sound calm, but cracking at the edges like thin glass under pressure, while Mark added in a defensive tone, bordering on a threat. "It's not your business. You're just the babysitter. Take care of him, and don't poke your nose where it doesn't belong." His words were like a slap in the face, a sharp pain that left me stunned, but they also confirmed my worst fears. The smell of reheated dinner in the microwave, turning nauseating in that moment of confrontation that felt like the prelude to an inevitable storm. I didn't press further that night, leaving the house with a lump in my throat that made it hard to swallow, the cold Melbourne wind whipping my face like a reminder that the outside world was as hostile as the secret hiding in that perfect house. But I couldn't stop. The fear for Oliver drove me like an internal engine that wouldn't shut off, a fire that burned with every new bruise I found, every evasive look he gave. When I asked about his accidents, I started seeking professional help, calling a child abuse hotline from a public phone in central Melbourne, the smell of cigarette smoke and cheap coffee from the booth clinging to my clothes like a layer of guilt I couldn't shake. The operator, a calm and professional voice cutting through the street noise, explained the steps. Document everything, take photos if safe, report to social services without delay, but warned, be careful. False accusations can cost you dearly, but if there are signs, act quickly to save the child. Her words echoed in my head like a constant hum, a suspense that grew with each day I didn't act, imagining the worst on nights when Oliver slept with a false peace that didn't hide the bruises under his pajamas. Finally, I gathered the courage and reported anonymously to social services, detailing the bruises, Oliver's behavior, the distant parents, my voice shaking on the phone as if each word were a step in a minefield that could explode at any moment. 2 days later, I got a call from a social worker, a firm but empathetic voice who scheduled an interview at a government office downtown, a gray building smelling of old papers and instant coffee that made me feel like I was entering a bureaucratic world where children's lives were decided in forms and meetings. I told them everything, showed the photos I'd taken discreetly, and felt a mix of relief and terror as I handed over the evidence, knowing this could save Oliver, but also destroy that family's facade, and maybe put me in danger if Sarah and Mark found out it was me who reported. The following days were a whirlwind of suspense, waiting for a call or visit confirming Oliver was safe, but also fearing retaliation from his parents, imagining scenarios where they confronted me at their doorstep with furious expressions hiding something more sinister, like veiled threats, or worse. A week later, the social worker contacted me. They'd launched an investigation, visited the home, interviewed Sarah and Mark and found evidence of physical abuse, old bruises, neighbor testimonies of hearing nighttime screams that sounded like a child's cries mixed with angry adult voices. Oliver was temporarily removed from the home, placed in foster care while the case progressed, and I was cited as the main witness, my identity protected for now, but with the possibility I'd have to testify in court if it went to trial. The relief was immense, like a weight lifted from my shoulders, allowing me to breathe for the first time in months. But the terror lingered, a whisper in my mind reminding me that Sarah and Mark wouldn't give up easily, that they might seek revenge against the babysitter who exposed their dark secret. I received anonymous calls on my phone, distorted voices whispering, "You should keep your mouth shut, Erica, or you'll regret it." The cold, calculated tone making me peer through my flat's windows, curtains drawn to block the view of streets where shadows stretched like accusing fingers under flickering streetlights. The case moved slowly, like a rusted train on an abandoned track, each hearing a step closer to the truth, unearthed like a forgotten corpse in a backyard. Sarah and Mark denied everything at first, claiming accidents and normal discipline, but the medical evidence, x-rays showing old rib fractures that didn't match childish falls, and Oliver's testimony, given to a child psychologist in a room with toys and drawings on the walls, smelling of crayons and hope, painted a picture of systematic abuse stretching back years, a pattern of blows and shouts that had turned the house into a hell disguised as a perfect home. Oliver, in therapy sessions the social worker described to me in confidence, confessed bit by bit. "Dad hits me when I'm bad. Mom says it's so I learn, but it hurts a lot and I cry alone." His words were like daggers in my heart, a sharp pain that made me cry silently in my flat, the echo of his imagined cries ringing in my ears like an eternal lament I couldn't silence. Finally, I sat with a police psychologist, a man with a deep voice and kind eyes, who listened to me in a small room with white walls smelling of disinfectant, where I confessed everything I'd seen and documented, every bruise, every whisper from Oliver, every veiled threat from his parents, my voice breaking as tears fell, releasing the weight of guilt and fear I'd carried for months. The court ruled that Sarah and Mark were guilty of aggravated child abuse, sentencing them to 10 years each in prison, their facade of model parents crumbling like a house of cards under the weight of the truth exposed in a courtroom, smelling of polished wood and human tension. Oliver was placed in my temporary custody while his adoption was resolved, and I, with social services support, officially adopted him 6 months later, becoming his legal guardian in a simple ceremony at a courthouse smelling of old papers and new beginnings, where his small hand in mine trembled but clung with a budding trust that filled my heart with a warmth that dispelled the chill of haunting memories. Today, Oliver and I live in Sydney, where the Australian sun erases the shadows of the past, and though the scars of abuse linger in his eyes when it rains and the sky darkens like those nights of terror, each day is a step toward healing, a reminder that love can rebuild what fear destroyed, but the suspense never fully fades. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I wonder if Sarah and Mark, from their prison cells, still think of the child they broke, and whether one day the cycle of abuse might try to reclaim us again. My name is Nayla, and what I'm about to tell you happened 2 years ago in Millbrook, a small town in Montana, where life moved with the quiet calm that only rural communities can offer. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, doors were rarely locked, and the most exciting news of the week was usually someone spotting a bear rummaging through trash bins. Millbrook had barely 3,000 residents, surrounded by mountains and forests that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was beautiful, but also isolated. The nearest city was an hour's drive away, and during winters, snowstorms often left us completely cut off from the outside world for days. I grew up there, in a working-class family. My father was a mechanic at the town's only auto shop, and my mother worked as a secretary at the elementary school. After graduating high school, I attended the state university for 2 years, studying early childhood education, but student loans became overwhelming. I returned home with the plan to work for a year to save money before continuing my studies. That's when I started babysitting. In a small town, job opportunities were limited, but there were always families needing help with childcare. My background in early childhood education and my local reputation made me a popular choice among working parents. One of the families I regularly worked for was the Richardsons. James Richardson owned the region's largest logging company, and his wife, Linda, was a nurse at the town clinic. They had 2 children, Emma, 8 years old, and Tyler, 5. The Richardsons lived in one of Millbrook's largest homes, a 2-story colonial-style house on a 5-acre property on the town's outskirts. The house was surrounded by dense trees, offering privacy, but also making it feel quite isolated, especially at night. The property had a long, winding driveway, and from the front windows, you couldn't see the nearest neighboring houses, which were nearly a mile away. James traveled frequently for business, inspecting logging operations across the state, and Linda often worked night shifts at the clinic. This meant I spent many evenings caring for Emma and Tyler in that large, quiet house. The kids were adorable and well-behaved. Emma was a voracious reader who could entertain herself for hours with a book, and Tyler was an energetic boy who loved building pillow forts and playing explorer. Both went to bed easily and rarely gave me trouble during my nighttime shifts. The Richardsons' house was comfortable and well-equipped. It had a modern security system, though they rarely activated it when I was there. In Millbrook, we don't need those things, James once told me. People here look out for each other. The night everything changed was a Friday in November. James was in Seattle for business and wouldn't return until Sunday. Linda had a double shift at the clinic, covering for a sick colleague, meaning she'd be gone from 6 in the evening until 6 the next morning. It was a particularly cold night, with strong winds making the trees around the house creak and sway. Snow began falling around 5 in the afternoon, and by the time I arrived at the Richardsons' house, a light layer already covered the ground. Emma and Tyler had eaten dinner before I arrived, so my job that night was mainly to supervise playtime, help with their bath routines, and put them to bed. The evening routine went smoothly. Emma read in her room for an hour after dinner, while Tyler and I built an elaborate tower with his building blocks in the living room. At 8 o'clock sharp, I took Tyler upstairs for his bath, and by 8:30, both kids were in bed. Emma stayed up reading with her bedside lamp for another 30 minutes, but by 9, both were asleep. I went downstairs to the living room and settled on the couch with my child psychology textbook. Though I'd paused my university studies, I kept studying on my own, hoping to resume formal education when I could afford it. The house was quiet, except for the sound of the wind outside and the occasional creak of the structure settling. Around 10:30, I was deep into a chapter on cognitive development when I heard a noise that made me look up. It was a metallic sound, like someone had accidentally bumped into something on the front porch. My first reaction was curiosity rather than alarm. Living in a wooded area, it wasn't uncommon for animals like raccoons or even bears to approach houses, especially if trash or pet food was left outside. I marked my page in the book and walked to the front window to see if I could spot the nighttime visitor. I pulled back the curtain slightly and looked out at the front porch. The porch light was on, casting a circle of visibility into the snowy darkness, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. The porch chairs were in place, and there were no signs of an animal rummaging around. I returned to the couch, but before I could reopen my book, I heard the noise again. This time, it was clearer. Definitely the sound of footsteps on the porch, followed by what sounded like someone testing the front door's handle. My heart started beating faster. In Millbrook, it was common for neighbors to drop by unannounced, but visits after 10:30 at night were extremely rare. Besides, any legitimate visitor would have rung the doorbell or knocked, not tested whether the door was unlocked. I stood up from the couch and cautiously approached the front door. There was a small window beside the door that would let me see who was on the porch without opening it. But when I looked, I saw no one. The handle moved again. This time, there was no doubt someone was trying to open the door. I stepped back from the window, my mind racing as I considered my options. I could be overreacting. Maybe it was a neighbor needing help with an emergency. But something about the stealthy nature of the movements told me that wasn't the case. I decided to call Linda at the clinic to ask if she was expecting anyone. I grabbed my cell phone and dialed the clinic's number. It rang several times before a receptionist answered. "Millbrook Clinic, how can I help you?" "Hi, I'm Nayla, babysitting for Linda Richardson's kids tonight. Could you tell her there's someone at her house's door? I want to make sure she's not expecting any visitors. One moment, please." As I waited, I heard more sounds from the door area, not just from the front now, but also from what seemed to be the back of the house. My anxiety spiked dramatically. The receptionist came back on the line. "Linda says she's definitely not expecting anyone, and you should call the sheriff immediately if someone's trying to get in." I hung up and dialed the county sheriff's department. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, someone answered. "Sheriff's Department, this is the emergency desk." "Hi, I'm Nayla Martinez. I'm babysitting at 1247 Elm Ridge Road, and someone's trying to break into the house. The kids are asleep upstairs, and I'm alone with them. Have you seen the people? Can you describe how many there are? I haven't seen them clearly, but I hear noises at both the front and back doors. I think there might be more than one person." "Okay, we're sending a patrol right away. Are you in a safe place inside the house?" "I'm in the living room. The kids are upstairs, sleeping. Go upstairs with the kids and lock yourself in a room if possible. Don't open the door for anyone except us. We'll be there in about 15 minutes. 15 minutes. In an emergency, 15 minutes feels like an eternity. I crept upstairs as quietly as possible, heading first to Emma's room. She was fast asleep, curled up under her blankets with her favorite book still on the nightstand. I woke her gently. "Emma, honey, I need you to wake up." She opened her eyes, confused. "Nayla? What's wrong?" "We need to go to Tyler's room and stay there for a bit. Can you come with me quietly?" Emma, though only 8 years old, was mature for her age. She could sense the urgency in my voice and nodded without questions. She got up and followed me barefoot down the hall to Tyler's room. Tyler was a heavier sleeper than his sister. It took several tries to wake him, and when he finally opened his eyes, he was disoriented and grumpy. "I don't want to get up," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Just for a little bit," I whispered. "We're going to play a quiet game in your room." Emma helped me convince Tyler to cooperate. The 3 of us sat on the floor of his room, and I locked the door. Tyler's room had a window overlooking the back of the house, away from the main driveway. For the next few minutes, I tried to keep the kids calm while listening intently for any sounds from downstairs. Emma seemed to realize something was wrong, but Tyler was half asleep and not fully aware of the situation. Then we heard the sound I'd been dreading, glass shattering. The noise came from downstairs, likely the kitchen or dining area. Someone had broken a window to get into the house. Emma looked at me with wide eyes. "What was that?" "Someone got into the house," I whispered, "but the police are on their way. We just need to stay quiet here until they arrive." Tyler was now fully awake and starting to panic. I could see tears forming in his eyes, and I knew I had to keep him calm or his sobs might alert the intruders to our location. "Tyler," I whispered, "remember the hide-and-seek game we play sometimes? We're going to play it now. We have to be super quiet like ninjas." This seemed to help. Tyler wiped his eyes and nodded solemnly. For the next few minutes, we listened to sounds of movement downstairs. Footsteps, whispering voices, the sound of drawers being opened. It seemed whoever had broken in was systematically searching the house. The voices grew louder as they approached the foot of the stairs. I could make out that they were male voices, and there seemed to be more than 2 people. My guess was there were likely 3 to 5 men in the house. "Where's the jewelry?" I heard one of them ask. "Richardson said there was a safe in the master bedroom," another replied. My blood ran cold. Not only did they know where the Richardsons lived, but they apparently had specific information about valuables in the house. This wasn't a random burglary. It was a planned job. "And the babysitter?" a third voice asked. "Her car's here. She must be upstairs with the kids." The confirmation that they knew about my presence and the kids filled me with terror. If they'd planned this robbery knowing we were here, it meant they'd already considered how to handle witnesses. I heard footsteps starting up the stairs. I motioned for Emma and Tyler to hide under Tyler's bed. It was a tight space, but they could both fit if they huddled together. I positioned myself between the bed and the door, trying to think of any way to protect the kids if the intruders entered. The footsteps stopped on the second-floor landing. I heard whispers, but couldn't make out the words. Then, footsteps approached down the hallway. The first door they tried was Emma's room. I heard the handle turn, the door open, footsteps enter the room, then leave after a moment. Next, they tried the master bedroom. More footsteps, voices, the sound of drawers being yanked open. Finally, they came to Tyler's room. The handle turned, but the door didn't open because I'd locked it. There was a moment of silence, then someone knocked softly on the door. "Hello," a male voice said, trying to sound friendly. "We know you're in there." "We just want to talk." I didn't respond. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure they could hear it. "Look, we don't want to hurt anyone. We just need you to come out so we can finish our work here." I stayed silent. There were more whispers, then the sound of someone tampering with the lock. After a few moments, they managed to open the door. 3 men entered the room. They wore ski masks covering their faces and dark clothing. One carried a flashlight. Another held what looked like a gun. "Hello, Naylor," said the one who seemed to be the leader. "Yes, we know your name. We also know you're a good girl, just doing your job. We don't want trouble with you." The fact that he knew my name terrified me even more. This had been planned in great detail. "Where are the kids?" he asked. I glanced at the bed, where Emma and Tyler were hiding. I could see the tips of Tyler's toes sticking out slightly from under the bedspread. They're asleep in their rooms," I lied. The man followed my glance to the bed and smiled beneath his mask. "Emma, Tyler, come out from under the bed," he said in a surprisingly gentle voice. "No one's going to hurt anyone here." After a moment, Emma crawled out from under the bed, followed by Tyler. Both looked terrified, but Emma kept a protective arm around her younger brother. "Good," the leader said. "Now, we're all going to go downstairs together. You're going to sit quietly in the living room while we finish what we came to do. Understood?" I had no choice but to nod. They escorted us downstairs to the living room, where I could see there were indeed 5 men total. They had thoroughly searched the ground floor, with drawers opened and sofa cushions moved. But surprisingly, they hadn't caused excessive damage or destroyed things unnecessarily. They sat us on the main couch. One of the men stayed with us as a guard, while the other 4 continued searching the house. The man watching us sat in a dining chair. They'd moved to have a clear view of us. "When do the parents get back?" he asked. "Linda won't be back until tomorrow morning," I answered honestly. There was no point in lying. They probably already knew the family's schedule. "And the dad?" "James is in Seattle. He won't be back until Sunday." The man nodded and relaxed slightly in his chair. For the next hour, the other men continued systematically searching the house. I could hear when they found the safe in the master bedroom and when they began working to open it. I also heard when they found what seemed to be a second safe or secure container in James's study. Emma, Tyler, and I stayed on the couch the entire time. Emma held Tyler's hand, and she occasionally whispered questions about when our parents or the police would come. I reassured her in whispers that everything would be okay, but honestly, I didn't know if that was true. Our guard was professional, but not hostile. He occasionally answered the kids' questions with short, reassuring responses. When Tyler asked to use the bathroom, the man escorted him and waited outside until he was done. "Are you police?" Tyler asked at one point, with the confused logic of a 5-year-old who couldn't understand why grown men were in his house at night. "No, champ," the guard replied. "We're just people who needed to come get something. We'll be gone soon." Around midnight, the other men finished their search. They'd managed to open both safes and had taken their contents, along with several other valuables from the house. But as I'd noticed earlier, they'd been relatively careful with the property, avoiding unnecessary destruction. The group's leader returned to the living room. "All right, we're almost done here," he announced. "You've been very cooperative, and we appreciate that." He addressed me specifically. "Nayla, we're going to need you to wait at least 1 hour before calling the police. That'll give us enough time to be far from here." "But I already called the police," I said, "before you broke in. They should be on their way." The 5 men tensed immediately. The leader stepped closer to me. "When did you call?" "Like an hour and a half ago. They said they'd be here in 15 minutes. The men exchanged worried glances. This was clearly a development they hadn't anticipated. "Why aren't they here yet?" one of them asked. Suddenly, we heard sirens in the distance. The sirens were approaching quickly. "Damn," the leader muttered. "They must have been responding to another call first." The men panicked. They started moving quickly through the house, gathering their tools and ensuring they hadn't left obvious evidence. But it was clear the sirens were very close now. "No time," the leader said. "We're going to have to stay until they leave." He turned to us. "No one's going to hurt anyone, but we need you to stay quiet when the police arrive. If you cooperate, this will end smoothly." The sirens were now deafening, and we could see red and blue lights reflecting off the windows. The men turned off all the house's lights and positioned themselves where they could see outside without being seen. We heard car doors slamming, voices, footsteps approaching the house. Then, someone knocked loudly on the front door. "Sheriff's Department, please respond." The group's leader looked at me. "Tell them everything's fine, that it was a false alarm." I approached the door, but didn't open it. "Officer?" "Yes, Mom. We got a call about intruders. Is everything okay in there?" I glanced back at the group's leader, who nodded threateningly. "Yes, everything's fine. I think it was animals outside. The kids are okay." There was a pause from the other side of the door. "Can you open the door, Mom? We need to visually confirm everyone's safe." The leader shook his head vigorously. The kids finally fell back asleep after the scare. I don't want to wake them again. I understand, but it's standard protocol to verify the safety of all occupants when we respond to a call like this. The 5 men were now extremely tense. One of them had drawn a gun and positioned himself where he could aim at the door if needed. "It'll just be a moment," the officer continued. "I promise we'll be quiet." The leader considered his options for a few seconds, then motioned for me to open the door. I opened the door slowly. 2 sheriff's deputies stood on the porch, both with flashlights, but no weapons drawn. "Good evening, Mom. I'm Deputy Johnson, and this is Deputy Martinez. Can we come in for a quick check?" I glanced back at the living room, where I could see the silhouette of the group's leader watching from the shadows. "Of course," I said, my voice sounding strained even to me. The deputies stepped inside and immediately noticed the house was unusually dark. "Power out?" Deputy Johnson asked. "No, we just turned off the lights to help the kids get back to sleep." Deputy Martinez shone his flashlight into the living room and immediately noticed the furniture had been moved. "Mom, could you turn on some lights, please?" Before I could respond, the group's leader stepped out from the shadows with his hands raised. "Officers, we don't want trouble," he said calmly. "No one's been hurt, and no one's going to get hurt." Both deputies immediately drew their weapons. "Hands up!" On the ground. "There are kids here," the leader said, staying calm, "and there are more of us in the house. I suggest we handle this carefully." Over the next few minutes, the situation escalated quickly. The other 4 men gradually emerged from their hiding spots, all with hands raised, but making it clear there were more of them than the 2 deputies had anticipated. Deputy Johnson used his radio to call for backup, but it was clear they were in a tough spot. The burglars outnumbered them, knew the house's layout, and had hostages. What followed was 3 hours of tense negotiation. The burglars didn't want to hurt anyone, but they also didn't want to be arrested. The deputies wanted to ensure our safety, but didn't have the manpower to overpower 5 men in a large house with multiple escape routes. Eventually, additional backup arrived, including a specialized hostage negotiator. The negotiator established communication by phone with the group's leader and began working toward a resolution. Throughout this time, Emma, Tyler, and I stayed in the living room. The kids were scared, but remarkably calm. Emma kept comforting Tyler, and both seemed to instinctively understand it was important to stay quiet and cooperative. The burglars, to their credit, kept their word about not harming anyone. They brought us water when we asked, allowed Tyler to use the bathroom when he needed to, and even found a blanket for Emma when she started shivering from the cold and adrenaline. Finally, around 3:30 in the morning, the negotiator reached an agreement. The burglars would surrender what they'd stolen and give themselves up peacefully in exchange for assurances about their treatment during arrest and processing. One by one, the 5 men walked out of the house with their hands raised and were arrested without incident. Emma, Tyler, and I were escorted outside, where an ambulance was waiting for medical evaluation and a social worker for immediate support. Linda arrived about an hour later, having been contacted at the clinic. Her relief at seeing Emma and Tyler physically unharmed was palpable, though it was clear the entire family would need time to process the psychological impact. The subsequent investigation revealed that the burglars had been watching the Richardson family for weeks. They knew about James's business trips, Linda's work schedule, and had been waiting for a night when the house would be occupied only by me and the kids. It was also discovered that they had inside information about the valuables in the house, including the safe's locations. An employee at James's company had been providing information in exchange for a cut of the loot. The 5 men were eventually convicted and sentenced to prison. The corrupt employee was also arrested and prosecuted. The Richardson family recovered most of their stolen belongings. For me, the experience was traumatic, but also enlightening. I learned about my own ability to stay calm under extreme pressure and prioritize the children's safety above my own fear. I also gained a new appreciation for the training and professionalism of law enforcement officers. Emma and Tyler recovered remarkably well from the trauma. Both received professional counseling, and the family added extra security measures to their home. But within a few months, both kids had returned to their normal routines. I continued babysitting, though with a new awareness of potential risks and the importance of security protocols. I also resumed my university studies the following year, using the experience as motivation to complete my education in child development. Though it was one of the most terrifying nights of my life, it was also one of the most instructive, teaching me about resilience, courage, and the importance of community in times of crisis. And I'm deeply grateful that, despite the terrible circumstances, we all emerged physically unharmed from the experience. Hello everyone, I'm Kiara, and I now live in a small apartment in Portland, Oregon, where the constant rain taps the windows like an endless drumbeat, and the air smells of wet pine and freshly brewed coffee. I'm 28 years old, working as a freelance graphic designer, spending my days creating logos for startups, while trying to keep at bay the memories that this city, with its gray sky and sticky humidity, seems determined to unearth. But when I was 10 years old, my life was different. I lived in a suburb of Tacoma, Washington, in a 2-story house with a neglected garden where weeds grew taller than me. I was a shy girl with messy pigtails and a notebook where I drew flowers and happy houses that never looked like mine. My childhood wasn't a fairy tale. It was a minefield of silences and secrets, where fear didn't come from monsters under the bed, but from a man who lived in my house, my stepfather, and from a night that changed everything. Sit down, because this isn't just an anecdote. It's a haunting memory that stalks me, an echo of screams and blood that still resonates in my head, like the creak of floorboards in that old house when someone walked in the dark. It all began when I was 10 years old, in the summer of 2007, when the air in Tacoma smelled of freshly cut grass and hot asphalt under the sun. We lived in a white wooden house with a creaking porch and a rusty swing that squeaked in the wind. My mother, Linda, was a waitress at a local diner, always with tired eyes and a uniform that reeked of fried food and spilled coffee. She worked double shifts to keep us afloat, and though she loved me, her love was like a tattered blanket, warm but full of holes. My stepfather, Greg, was a big man with hands like shovels and a laugh that sounded like gravel sliding down a slope. He worked as a mechanic in an auto shop, coming home smelling of motor oil and cheap beer, with a look that made me want to hide under the table. He wasn't my father. My biological father left when I was 3 years old, leaving only a blurry photo in an album my mother kept in the attic. Greg came into our lives a year later with promises of stability and a smile that fooled everyone but me. There was something about him, a shadow in his eyes when he looked at me too long that made me clench my teeth and clutch my drawing notebook like a shield. My lifeline in those days was Clara, my babysitter. Clara was a woman in her 40s with brown hair tied in a loose bun, green eyes that seemed to see through walls, and a soft voice that soothed my nightmares. She came into our home when I was 5 years old, after my mother, exhausted from night shifts, posted an ad for help. Clara was more than a babysitter. She was my confidant, my protector, the one who read me adventure stories while the smell of freshly baked cookies filled the kitchen, the one who taught me to shade my flowers to make them look real. But there was also something about her, a deep sadness she didn't explain, as if she carried a weight she couldn't share. My mother liked her, or at least tolerated her, because Clara kept the house in order and kept me out of trouble. Greg, however, treated her with cold disdain, as if her presence bothered him, though he never said why. I noticed the tension, the way Clara's lips tightened when Greg entered the room, the slight tremble in her hands when she served him dinner, but at 10 years old, I didn't understand what it meant. I only knew that with Clara around, I felt safe, as if the world was less heavy when she was in the house, her lavender perfume mixing with the smell of old wood and dampness that permeated the walls. The house itself was a place that never felt like home. It was large, but always cold, even in summer, with drafts whistling through poorly sealed windows. My room was on the second floor, a small space with a creaky iron bed, a desk cluttered with crayons, and a closet where I kept my clothes and my secrets. There were nights when I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, heavy and slow, as if someone was testing the floorboards to avoid making noise. At first, I thought it was my imagination, fueled by the mystery books Clara read me before bed, but then I started noticing things. A door slightly ajar that I swore I'd closed, a shadow moving in the hallway when everyone should have been asleep, the smell of stale beer lingering in the air even when Greg wasn't home. My mother said it was just childish imagination, that I should stop making up stories, but Clara listened to my fears with attention, her green eyes darkening as if she knew something I didn't. "If you ever feel something's wrong, Kiara, you tell me, okay?" she'd say, her voice low but firm, as the Tacoma wind battered the windows like an invisible fist. The first sign that something was truly wrong came one July night, when the heat was so sticky my pajamas clung to my skin like a second layer. I'd stayed up late, drawing in my notebook under the dim light of a lamp, when I heard the front door open and close with a dull thud. It was Greg, coming home later than usual, his voice echoing downstairs as he spoke to my mother in a tone that wasn't quite an argument, but wasn't kind either. Clara was in the kitchen, washing the dinner dishes. Her shift ended at 9, but she sometimes stayed longer if my mother was exhausted. I heard Greg's footsteps climbing the stairs, heavy and clumsy, the smell of beer preceding him like a toxic cloud. He passed my room without stopping, but something about the way his shadow stretched in the hallway made me close my notebook and turn off the lamp, my heart racing like a trapped rabbit's. I don't know why, but I slipped under the covers, pretending to sleep, holding my breath as the footsteps paused at my door. The handle turned slowly, a metallic creak slicing through the silence, and I felt the air shift as the door opened. I didn't move, didn't breathe, my eyes half open, seeing only the darkness under the sheets, but I heard his breathing, heavy and uneven, and the creak of the floor as he took a step into my room. I don't know how long he stood there, maybe seconds, maybe minutes, but he eventually left, the door closing with a soft click that echoed in my ears like a gunshot. When I was sure he was gone, I sat up in bed, trembling, the the smell of beer still lingering in the air like a bad omen. I didn't tell anyone that night, not even Clara, because part of me felt ashamed, as if I'd done something wrong by being scared. But after that, I started noticing more. The way Greg looked at me when my mother wasn't around, his eyes lingering, like he was studying something he didn't understand. The times he came into my room for no reason, saying he was just checking everything was okay. The way his large, calloused hands seemed to find excuses to touch me, a brush on the shoulder, a squeeze on the arm that lasted too long. I didn't know how to name what I felt, but it was like an internal alarm blaring whenever he was near, a constant beep that made me want to run. Clara noticed too. Her eyes followed Greg like a hawk's, and she started staying later at night, even when my mother told her it wasn't necessary. "I don't like leaving you alone, Kiara," she'd say, her voice a whisper as she folded laundry in the living room, the smell of lavender detergent mixing with the humid air coming through the open windows. I didn't fully understand, but her presence was a shield, a barrier between me and the shadow that seemed to grow in Greg's eyes with each passing day. The breaking point came one August night when the sky was so dark it seemed the world had forgotten dawn. My mother was working the night shift at the diner, leaving the house in an oppressive silence, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old wood. Clara was in the living room, reading a book under the yellowish light of a lamp, while I tried to sleep in my room, my notebook open on the nightstand with a half-finished drawing of a twisted tree that seemed to scream. I woke suddenly, not from a noise, but from a feeling, a weight in the air, as if someone had stolen all the oxygen from the room. My bedroom door was slightly ajar, and before I could move, I saw Greg's silhouette in the doorway, his figure outlined against the dim hallway light. The smell of beer and sweat filled the room, so strong I could almost taste it, and my body froze, my hands clutching the sheets as if they could protect me. "Just came to check on you, little one," he said, his voice low and thick, like the words were crawling across the floor. He took a step toward my bed, then another, and panic wrapped me like a suffocating blanket. My breath caught in my throat as my mind screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. I don't know how Clara knew something was wrong. Maybe she heard the footsteps, or maybe it was that instinct she always seemed to have when it came to me. All I know is that she was suddenly there, in my bedroom doorway, her small but imposing figure holding a kitchen knife that gleamed under the hallway light. "Get away from her, Greg," she said, her voice steady, but with an edge sharper than the knife itself. Greg turned, startled, and for a moment, time froze. The three of us trapped in a tableau of terror, me in bed, trembling under the sheets, Greg, with his hands raised as if to calm her, and Clara, her eyes blazing with a fury I'd never seen in her. "You don't know what you're talking about, Clara. I'm just checking on the kid," he said, but his voice was a growl, and he took a step toward her, as if he thought he could intimidate her. It was a mistake. Clara didn't back down. Instead, she stepped forward, the knife pointed at his chest, and shouted, "Don't touch her!" Never again. What happened next was fast, too fast for my childish mind to fully process. There was a struggle, a choked scream, the sound of something heavy hitting the floor, and then silence, a deafening silence that seemed to suck the air from the room. When I dared to look, Greg was on the floor, blood pooling from his chest, his eyes open in a frozen expression of surprise. Clara stood over him, the knife still in her hand, her breathing ragged, and she looked at me with a mix of fear and determination I'll never forget. "Kiara, stay there," she said, her voice breaking for the first time as the metallic smell of blood mingled with the humid night air. I don't remember much of the hours that followed, only fragments. Clara calling the police from the living room phone, her voice shaky but clear as she explained what happened. Sirens cutting through the night like knives, officers entering the house, their boots echoing on the wooden floor. My mother arriving from work, her face pale as the moon as she hugged Clara, then me, her tears wetting my hair as she repeated, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Clara was arrested that night, the handcuffs glinting under the patrol car lights as they took her away, her eyes seeking mine as if to ensure I was safe. The police found evidence of what Greg had tried to do. My statement, though stammered and tearful, confirmed he'd entered my room with intentions that still make me shudder. But there was also Greg's body and the knife in Clara's hand, and the law doesn't always see clearly when blood is still fresh on the floor. The months that followed were a blur of interrogations, hearings, and sleepless nights. My mother and I moved to a small apartment in downtown Tacoma, away from the house that now felt like a tomb. Clara was charged with homicide, and though my mother and I testified in her defense, recounting how Greg had been a growing threat, the prosecutor argued that Clara had acted with premeditation, that the knife wasn't just defense, but vengeance. I was too young to understand the legal details, but I remember the courtroom, a place that smelled of polished wood and sweat, where Clara sat with her head bowed, her bun undone, as a lawyer tried to explain she'd saved my life. I wanted to scream, to tell them Clara was my hero, that without her I wouldn't be here, but my voice was small, and the adult world doesn't always listen to children. Clara was sentenced to 7 years in prison, a verdict that broke my heart, because every night when I closed my eyes, I saw her face, her green eyes full of love and fear, and the knife she'd used to protect me. Life without Clara was like walking through a desert. My mother tried to make up for it, quitting the diner and taking an office job that let her be home more, but the damage was done. I carried the trauma like an invisible backpack, heavy with stones, waking me with nightmares where Greg was still alive, his hands reaching for me in the dark. I drew more, but my flowers turned black, their petals like claws, and my happy houses became ruins with broken windows. My mother took me to therapy, where a kind woman with big glasses asked how I felt, but I didn't know how to explain the void Clara left or the fear that lingered when I heard footsteps in the hallway of our new apartment, even though I knew Greg was dead. I wrote letters to Clara, telling her about school, my drawings, the little things I did to stay sane, but I never got replies, because, as I later learned, prison doesn't always allow those connections, and she didn't want me to see her in a cell, surrounded by bars and despair. The years passed, and I became a teenager, then an adult, carrying the weight of that night like a shadow that never fully faded. I moved to Poland to study graphic design, seeking a place where the constant rain might wash away the memories, but the past has a way of clinging to you, like dampness seeping into the cracks of an old house. I kept in touch with my mother, who now lives in Seattle, but our relationship never regained the warmth it had before Greg. She blames herself for not seeing the signs, for bringing that man into our lives, and I don't know how to absolve her, because part of me blames her too, though I don't say it out loud. But Clara was my beacon, my anchor, and knowing she was in prison for saving me ate at me, a dull pain that flared every time I saw her name on one of the letters I kept in a box under my bed. A year ago, everything changed again. I got a call from a lawyer, a calm voice that contrasted with the chaos in my mind. "Kiara, I'm Clara's representative. There's news about her case." My heart lurched, and the smell of burnt coffee in my Portland apartment became unbearable as I listened. A legal defense group had reviewed Clara's case, arguing that the conviction was unjust, that the evidence of Greg's threat, my statements, neighbor testimonies of hearing shouts in the house before that night, psychological reports on the trauma's impact on me, was enough to prove Clara acted in self-defense. A new hearing was scheduled, and this time I was ready to speak, not as a scared child, but as an adult who understood the weight of what had happened. I testified in a courtroom that smelled of disinfectant and tension, my voice trembling but firm, recounting every detail of that night, the fear I felt when Greg entered my room, the way Clara appeared like an avenging angel, the knife gleaming not with hate, but with love. The judge, a stern-faced woman with kind eyes, listened in silence, and when the hearing ended, the ruling was in Clara's favor, immediate parole, with her conviction overturned as justified self-defense. Clara was released from prison a month later, on a spring morning when the Tacoma air smelled of wildflowers and second chances. I went to pick her up at the bus station, my heart pounding as if it might explode, and when I saw her, her hair now gray, but still tied in a loose bun, her green eyes shining with tears, I ran to her and hugged her as I never could as a child. "Kiara, my girl," she whispered, her voice broken by the years, but full of a love time hadn't touched. We cried together, there in the middle of the station, as buses roared and people passed without understanding that this embrace was the culmination of a decade of pain and hope. Today, Clara lives with me in Portland. My apartment is small, but we've made space for her things. A shelf with poetry books she reads on rainy nights, a lavender plant she tends like a treasure, and a photo of us on the wall, taken the day she was freed, her eyes shining with a peace I'd never seen in her before. I work from home, and sometimes, while designing on my computer, I hear her humming a Hungarian song, an echo of her childhood she never shared when she was my babysitter. We've built a life together, not as babysitter and child, but as family, two survivors of a night that could have broken everything, but instead bound us together. But the fear doesn't fully fade. There are nights when I wake to the echo of Greg's footsteps in the hallway, or the smell of blood I can never fully wash from my memory. And sometimes, when Clara looks at me, I see in her eyes the weight of what she did, not from regret, but from the cost of crossing a line to save me. This is the story that marked my childhood, a haunting memory that still whispers in the shadows, but also the story of how love can be stronger than fear, sharper than any knife, and more enduring than any scar. My name is Juana, and what I'm about to tell you happened when I was 7 years old in London during the summer of 1995. It's a story I've carried with me for nearly 30 years, and though time has softened some edges of the pain, I'll never forget the woman who gave her life to save mine. Her name was Margaret O'Brien, but I called her simply Maggie. She was my nanny, though that word never truly captured what she meant to me. She was Irish, 42 years old when she came to work for my family, and she had a maternal warmth my own mother seemed unable to offer. My mother, Patricia Whitmore, was an ambitious woman who worked as a senior editor at a prestigious London fashion magazine. My father, Richard, was an investment banker who spent more time in his office than at home. Both were successful, intelligent, and well-meaning people, but their demanding careers meant I spent most of my days in Maggie's care. Maggie came to our family when I was 3 years old, recommended by a top-tier domestic staffing agency. We lived in a 4-story Victorian house in Kensington, a neighborhood that breathed elegance and old money. The house was beautiful, but cold, filled with expensive antiques and modern art my parents had collected during their business trips across Europe. From the first day, Maggie brought something different to that house. Laughter, Irish folktales, the aroma of homemade bread baking in the kitchen, and above all, genuine and constant attention to a little girl who desperately needed to feel loved. While my mother rose early for editorial meetings and my father left before dawn for the Asian markets, Maggie was the one who woke me each morning with a smile, who braided my hair while telling me stories of leprechauns and Irish castles, who made my breakfast and ensured I ate every bite. Maggie was the one who attended my school plays when my parents were too busy. She was the one who comforted me when I had nightmares, who taught me to ride a bike in Hyde Park, who helped with my homework every afternoon. She was the one who listened to me talk about my days, my fears, my childish dreams, with an attention I never found in my own mother. It wasn't that my parents were deliberately neglectful or cruel. They simply seemed to live in a parallel world to mine, one where deadlines, board meetings, and social engagements mattered more than a little girl's emotional needs. They loved me, I'm sure of it, but their love was expressed through expensive toys, private piano lessons, and vacations at exclusive resorts where Maggie always came along to care for me while they played golf or attended business dinners. Maggie, in contrast, loved me in a way that felt unconditional and present. She knew me better than anyone. She knew I hated spinach, but would eat any vegetable if she made it with cheese. That I was afraid of thunder, but a cup of hot chocolate and her tales of brave Celtic warriors calmed me. That I loved when she read to me in her Irish accent, especially stories of fairies and magical adventures. On Sundays, when my parents often worked or attended social commitments, Maggie took me to explore London. We visited small museums, fed ducks in Regent's Park, or simply wandered through local markets where she taught me about different types of flowers, spices, and cheeses. Those Sundays with Maggie were the happiest days of my childhood. Maggie was also the one who handled discipline in my life in a way my parents never managed. She didn't yell or punish. Instead, she explained why certain actions were wrong and helped me understand the consequences of my choices. When I did something wrong, she'd sit me down and ask how I'd feel if someone did the same to me. It was an education in empathy that would shape my character for life. But there was something about Maggie's life I didn't fully understand as a child, something I'd only grasp years later. She was running from a violent past in Northern Ireland. Maggie rarely spoke about her life before coming to London. I knew she'd grown up in Belfast, that she'd lost her husband in the Troubles, as she euphemistically referred to the sectarian conflicts, and that she'd never had children of her own. But it wasn't until much later that I understood the depth of trauma she carried, and how her love for me filled a void in her heart left by her husband's death. The summer of 1995 began like any other. My parents had planned a 2-week vacation in Tuscany, and as usual, Maggie would stay with me in London. I preferred these arrangements. Family vacations often left me feeling like a spectator in my parents' lives, while time with Maggie always felt like real adventures designed just for me. We'd planned to visit the London Zoo, have picnics in Hampstead Heath, and maybe even take a train to Brighton for a day at the beach. Maggie had been especially excited about this last plan, saying she'd always wanted to show me the sea, but we'd never had the chance. My parents left on a Tuesday morning, leaving their usual instructions: hotel phone numbers, emergency money, reminders about my Thursday piano lessons. Maggie and I waved them off from the front door, and then she took my hand and said, "Well, little one, Now we have 2 whole weeks to ourselves. What adventure do you want to have first? The first few days were magical. We went to the zoo, where Maggie spun elaborate stories about every animal we saw, inventing names and personalities for them. We visited the Natural History Museum, where she pretended to be scared of the dinosaurs just to make me laugh. We made Irish biscuits in the kitchen, making a mess of every surface, but laughing so hard my stomach hurt. It was the Friday of that first week when everything changed. Maggie and I had gone shopping at Portobello Road Market. It was one of our favorite places. Maggie knew many of the vendors and always found little treasures, old storybooks, vintage trinkets, or special Irish sweets she ordered from a vendor who'd immigrated from Cork. We were browsing storybooks at a store when Maggie suddenly tensed. Following her gaze, I saw a man standing across the market watching us. He was tall, thin, with dark hair and an expression that even at 7 years old I recognized as menacing. "Juana," Maggie said quietly, "we need to leave now." Her tone was urgent but controlled, the same one she used when she wanted me to obey immediately without questions. She took my hand firmly and began walking quickly toward the market's exit, but the man followed us. Maggie picked up the pace, weaving through the Friday afternoon crowds of shoppers. I had to jog to keep up, confused, but trusting that Maggie knew what she was doing. She always did. When we reached the main street, Maggie did something she'd never done before. She lifted me into her arms, despite my being too old to be carried regularly, and practically ran to the nearest bus stop. "Maggie, what's wrong?" I asked, but she just held me tighter and murmured something in Irish I didn't understand. A bus was approaching, and Maggie waved her arm frantically to stop it. As we boarded, I looked out the back window and saw the man standing on the sidewalk, watching as we pulled away. His eyes met mine through the glass, and a cold smile spread across his face. During the ride home, Maggie explained as little as possible. The man was someone from her past in Northern Ireland, someone dangerous who had unfinished business with her. She wouldn't go into details, but made me promise that if I ever saw him near our house or school, I'd run immediately to find an adult for help. "Are you going to tell Mummy and Daddy?" I asked. Maggie considered this for a moment. "Not yet, little one. I don't want to ruin their holiday over something that might be nothing, but we're going to be extra careful for a few days, okay?" That night, Maggie checked all the house's locks twice before going to bed. She also wedged a chair against the front door, something she'd never done before. When I asked why, she said it was just an extra precaution. The next few days passed relatively normally, though I noticed Maggie was more alert than usual. When we went out, her eyes constantly scanned the surroundings, and she always took different routes to the same places. She also began limiting our outings, suggesting more indoor activities. It was the Tuesday of the second week when he appeared again. I was in the back garden, playing with my dolls under the large oak tree that dominated our yard, when Maggie came running out of the house. "Juana, inside. Now," she said, her voice tight. "But I just came out," I protested. "Now, Juana." Her tone left no room for argument. I followed her inside, where she immediately locked and bolted the garden door. "Stay away from the windows," she instructed, guiding me to the center of the living room. "Maggie, you're scaring me." She knelt in front of me, taking my hands in hers. Her green eyes, usually full of warmth and laughter, were serious and worried. "Juana, my love, I need you to be very brave now. Do you remember the man from the market?" I nodded. "He's outside. He's going to try to hurt us, but I'm not going to let that happen. Understand?" "Why does he want to hurt us?" "It's complicated, little one. It's about things that happened in Ireland a long time ago, before I came to care for you. But the important thing is that you stay safe. Maggie led me to the cupboard under the stairs, a small space where we stored winter coats and cleaning supplies. I want you to hide here, she said. No matter what you hear, don't come out until I come get you. Promise? What if you don't come? I asked, with that terrible intuition children sometimes have. I'll come, she assured me, but I could see tears forming in her eyes. But if something happens, if I don't, call 911 and tell them there's a dangerous man in the house. Then call your parents. Do you remember the hotel number? I nodded, though my mind was starting to cloud with fear. You're the bravest, smartest girl I know, Juana. Whatever happens, remember I love you more than anything in this world. She kissed my forehead, tucked me into the cupboard, and closed the door gently. For the next few minutes, I heard sounds of Maggie moving through the house. Footsteps on the stairs, drawers opening and closing, the sound of the phone being picked up and quickly hung up. Then, the doorbell rang. I heard Maggie's footsteps heading toward the front door, but she didn't open it immediately. What do you want, Seamus? She shouted through the door. Her voice had a thicker Irish accent than I'd ever heard before. Just want to talk, Maggie, a male voice with a rough Irish accent replied. About old times. I've got nothing to say to you. Go away, but I've got plenty to say to you. About Danny, about what happened that night in Belfast. There was a long silence. Then I heard the sound of locks being undone. You have 5 minutes, Maggie said. That's more like the Maggie I remember. Always so hospitable. I heard footsteps entering the house, the door closing, then voices moving toward the living room. At first, their voices were low, and I couldn't make out the words, but gradually, the conversation grew more heated. You thought you could just disappear, the man was saying. Thought no one would find you here in your little perfect English life. I never did anything wrong, Seamus. I just refused to lie for you. You refused to stand by your own people. Your own husband died for the cause, and you refused to honor his memory. Danny died because people like you convinced him to plant a bomb in a pub full of innocent civilians. I'm not honoring that. I never will. That pub was full of collaborators. That pub was full of fathers just wanting a pint after work, like my Danny would have been doing if he hadn't been dying in an alley because his own bomb went off too soon. There was a sound of something slamming, maybe a hand against a table. You owe us, Maggie, a blood debt. My only debt was to that little girl upstairs, and it's a debt of love, not blood. Oh yes, the little English princess. Must be nice playing happy family with imperialist money. Leave Juana out of this. She's got nothing to do with our troubles. Oh, but she does now. Because you brought her into this when you decided to steal our money and run. I didn't steal anything. That money was for widows and orphans. I used it exactly for that, to care for a child who needed me. The conversation grew more hostile. Seamus accused Maggie of treason, of stealing funds from the paramilitary organization, of giving information to British authorities. Maggie denied everything except one thing. She had taken money meant for the cause and used it to start her new life in London. It was blood money, she insisted. Money made from bombs and murders. If I used it to raise an innocent child, that was the only good thing that money ever did. Very noble, Maggie. But debts have to be paid. What do you want? £500 now. 1,000 more every month until we've got back everything you owe us. And information on any Irish in London you know who might be cooperating with the British. I don't have that kind of money, and I'm not betraying anyone else. Then we'll find other ways to collect. That's when I heard the sound that would chill my blood, Juana screaming from upstairs. But I was in the cupboard. Who had screamed my name? "She's upstairs," Seamus shouted. "The little princess is upstairs." "No," Maggie screamed. "Juana's not here. She's with friends." But I could already hear heavy footsteps running toward the stairs. Maggie shouted something in Irish, and then I heard sounds of a struggle. Furniture shifting, glass breaking, Maggie yelling for him to stop. "If I can't collect my debt from you, I'll collect it from her," Seamus shouted. "Please, no. I'll give you anything you want. Just leave the girl alone." The sounds of struggle continued, now moving across the ground floor. I could hear Maggie fighting desperately, likely trying to keep Seamus from going upstairs to where he thought I was. Then I heard the most terrible sound of all, Maggie screaming in agony. "This is what happens to traitors," Seamus shouted. There were more sounds of struggle, more screams from Maggie, then a horrible silence. After what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps going up the stairs. "Little princess," Seamus called out. "I know you're up here. Your traitorous nanny can't protect you anymore." I heard doors being slammed open as he searched the second-floor rooms. My bedroom, my parents' bedroom, the bathroom, my father's study. "Come on, little one. I just want to talk to you about your dear Maggie." The footsteps grew closer to the stairs, leading to the ground floor, near where I was hiding. Then I heard the weakest, broken voice from Maggie downstairs. "Juana, run." Seamus must have heard it too, because his footsteps stopped. "Still got some fight in you, eh, Maggie?" His voice now came from the bottom of the stairs. "Let's finish this first." What followed were the most horrific sounds I'd ever heard in my life. Maggie, my dear Maggie, was being murdered downstairs while I hid helplessly in a cupboard. Her screams grew weaker, then stopped entirely. There was silence for several minutes. Then, footsteps moving through the house again. "Little princess," Seamus shouted again. "Your nanny's dead. If you come out now, I'll make it quick for you too." But I didn't come out. I stayed curled up in that dark cupboard, trembling with terror, following the last instructions Maggie had given me. After what must have been hours, though time had lost all meaning, I heard sirens approaching. "Damn!" Seamus muttered. I heard footsteps running toward the back of the house, then the sound of the garden door opening and closing. The sirens grew louder, then stopped outside our house. Voices shouting, "Police!" Opened the door. When there was no response, I heard the sound of the front door being forced open. "There's someone injured here," a male voice shouted. More voices, footsteps running through the house. Search the whole house. There could be more victims. Finally, after what seemed like another eternity, the cupboard door opened. The light blinded me temporarily, and when my eyes adjusted, I saw a uniformed police officer kneeling in front of me. "Hello, sweetheart," he said gently. "I'm Constable Williams. Are you Juana?" I nodded, unable to speak. "You're safe now. Let's get you out of here." He carried me out of the cupboard, but not before I saw Maggie's body in the living room. She lay motionless on the floor, surrounded by a pool of blood, her green eyes open but lifeless. I screamed. The next few days were a blur of police interviews, hugs from my parents who had rushed back from Italy, and the horrible reality that Maggie was gone forever. The police investigation revealed that Seamus O'Sullivan was a high-ranking member of an Irish Republican paramilitary organization. He had been tracking Maggie for years, following false leads across Europe before finally locating her in London. It was also discovered that Maggie had been sending money regularly to families of victims of the Northern Ireland conflict, both Catholic and Protestant, using funds she'd taken from the paramilitary organization before fleeing. In her letters, which the police found in her room, she had documented every family she'd helped, every child, she'd been able to feed or educate with that blood money. Seamus was never caught. He'd apparently had an escape route planned and managed to leave the country before the police could track him down. He remained on the most wanted list for years, but it was later believed he died in an armed confrontation in Belfast several years later. My parents, devastated by Maggie's loss and traumatized by how close they'd come to losing me too, decided to move from that house immediately. We bought a new home in a different neighborhood, installed a sophisticated security system, and hired private protection for several months until the police were convinced there were no further threats. But no amount of security could fill the void Maggie left in my life. The years that followed were difficult. My parents, feeling guilty for not being there when I needed them most, tried to make up for it by spending more time with me. But the damage was done. I'd learned to rely emotionally on Maggie, and her loss left a wound that would take years to heal. We never had another nanny. My parents reorganized their work schedules to be more present, and when that wasn't possible, I stayed with classmates' families or in after-school programs, but I never again had that close, maternal bond I'd had with Maggie. I grew up gradually understanding the complexity of what had happened. Maggie hadn't been the innocent victim I'd thought as a child. She'd been involved, albeit peripherally, in a violent conflict that had torn lives apart on both sides. But I also understood that her final actions, using money from a terrorist organization to help victims of all factions and ultimately giving her life to protect me, had redeemed her from any prior guilt. When I turned 18, I traveled to Belfast to visit the grave of Maggie's husband, Danny O'Brien. He died at 23 years old when a bomb he was planting detonated prematurely. His headstone was simple, with just his name and dates. There were no mentions of the cause or being a martyr, just a young man who died too soon. I also visited some of the families Maggie had helped with the money she'd taken. Many didn't even know where the help had come from. They'd received envelopes with cash and notes saying simply that they were from a friend who understood their pain. An elderly woman whose son had been killed by loyalist paramilitaries told me, "I don't know who your Maggie was, child, but she was an angel. That money paid for my son's funeral and helped me keep his little ones fed for 2 years. Without it, we'd have lost our home." I returned to London with a fuller understanding of who Maggie had been, a woman who'd made mistakes, who'd been entangled in terrible things, but who'd found redemption in love and care. First, for the anonymous victims of a brutal conflict, and then for a little girl who needed her. Now, every 9th of August, the anniversary of Maggie's death, I visit her grave in Kensal Green Cemetery. I bring Irish flowers when I can find them, or simply daisies, which were her favorites. I sit by her headstone and tell her about my life, my university studies, my career as a social worker, a choice directly inspired by her example, my relationships, my struggles and triumphs. I also thank her. I thank her for loving me when I needed it most. I thank her for teaching me about kindness, compassion, and sacrifice. And I thank her for giving her life to save mine. Because though Maggie died that terrible day in our Kensington home, she also saved something precious. She saved me. Not just physically, by hiding me in that cupboard, but emotionally, by giving me during my formative years the kind of unconditional love that would shape who I'd become. I'm 37 years old now, and I have my own daughter, Sarah Margaret, named after my mother and Maggie. When I tuck her in each night, I often tell her stories of Irish leprechauns and magical castles, using the same accent Maggie used with me. And when my daughter asks where those stories come from, I tell her about the woman who raised me, who loved me more than her own life, and who taught me that true love sometimes requires the greatest sacrifice of all. Every 9th of August, when I place those flowers on Maggie's grave, I whisper the same words. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for teaching me how to love. Because in a world full of violence and hate, Maggie chose love. And that love, even after nearly 30 years, remains the most powerful force in my life.